Hi friends, in this video we're going to talk about how to set up Apache HTTP web server in Windows using Apache Launch. What is Apache HTTP server? It is an open source HTTP web server that can deliver web content. It's one of the most used web servers and it's known for its security, robustness and reliability. If you had a requirement of hosting a public facing server using open source systems, chances are you would have heard about Apache server. So this is the homepage of Apache HTTP server project. It is the most popular open source HTTP server project out there. So why do people use Apache HTTP server? If you want to say it in one line, it's an awesome web server. But the use cases of using Apache web server are static file hosting or directory browsing. That means you just want to show your folder to the public on the internet and people can just see the files but not modify the files. So this is called static file hosting and it's one of the most popular use cases of using Apache HTTP server. And Apache server is a very secure and reliable reverse proxy also. And Apache HTTP server can also do server-side rendering and host websites like PHP, Perl, Lua, and it can also be used as an FTP server. It can do URL rewriting, HTTP redirection, gzip compression and decompression, and many more use cases are present for Apache HTTP server. In this video, we want to talk about how to set up Apache server for Windows. But in reality, Apache server is officially supported for Linux based systems. But if you want to set up Apache web server in Windows, there is a third party website called Apache Launch and you can download Apache for Windows from there. In this video, we will cover how to set up Apache server in Windows and we will also show you the examples of directory browsing or static file hosting and also the concept of virtual hosts in Apache server. So the first step, setting up Apache server for Windows. As I said, you can go to Apache Launch and download Apache server software for there. So let's go to Google and search Apache Launch and you get Apache Launch here. And here go to the download section and download Apache for Windows 64-bit. So I'm downloading the zip file. And after you download the zip file, open the zip file and you can see a folder called Apache 2.4 or the Apache folder, and in that folder all the Apache server installation files would be present. So you can copy this folder and press it in your C drive. So I have copied the Apache 2.4 folder from the zip file and pasted it in my C drive, and now Apache 2.4 is present in my C drive and I can run Apache server in my Windows system. Alright, we have successfully downloaded Apache. Now how to run Apache? So just go to the bin folder and you have a httpd.exe file, and if you run this httpd.exe, Apache server will run. So let's double click this httpd.exe and now the command line is running. Let's go to the browser and enter localhost and now you can see it works. Since Apache is running, the home page is running and we are seeing a web page called it works. So now my Apache server is running. So just by double clicking this httpd.exe, a command line will open and this command line is actually the Apache server. And you can prove that it's running by just going to the localhost and you should see a page that says it works. But if you close this command prompt and reload the page, it doesn't work because when you double click httpd.exe, a command prompt opens and that is actually the server. So users can accidentally close the command prompt. So I don't want to run this httpd.exe as a command line. I would like to run it as a Windows server. So for that, there is a convenient command in Apache. Just go to the bin folder where the httpd.exe is present and open a command prompt here. So I'm going to go to the address bar and write cmd here. And now I've opened a command prompt in C Apache 24 bin folder where I have the httpd.exe file. To run Apache as a Windows server, just write the command httpd.exe space -k install. So what this does is it will install your Apache command line as a Windows server. So let's try to run this. Since I have already run this command and I have a service of Apache 24 installed as a Windows server, I'm getting this error. But if you did not install Apache 24 as a Windows server, the command will execute and it will register an Apache 24 service in your Windows services. So I have run the command httpd.exe -k install in the bin folder and now my service is installed. So let's try to see our Windows services and see whether Apache server is present and run it. So let's try to close this command prompt and now let's try to see the Windows services. So for that, open the run and I'm going to write services.msc And here I can see the Windows services. You can even see the Windows services by just typing the Windows button and writing services. So you can see the services app. You can even open your services like this. And now in the services, since you have registered the Apache as a Windows service, you should be able to see a service here called Apache 2.4. So this is the Windows service which have been created using the command line httpd.exe-k install. And you can see it's not running. Let's right click and start this Windows service. And now the Apache 2.4 service is running. That means without a command line, Apache server is running as a Windows service. Alright, let's try to see whether the server is running. Let's try to reload this page and you can see it works. Without a command line, I'm able to run my Apache service as a Windows service. So hey, very easily we have set up an Apache server in Windows and run it as a Windows background service. Alright, just this page doesn't suffice, right? You want to use this or configure this server as per your requirement. So how can you configure the Apache web server? So inside the Apache 2.4 folder, there is a main folder called conf and there is a main file called httpd.conf, and this is the main file where you can configure your Apache server. So you can just edit it in a notepad. So I'm going to right click and open with notepad, and this is the server configuration. But hey, wouldn't it be nice if you are able to do some syntax highlighting and see it in a colorful format? For that requirement, you have an awesome VS Code extension. Let's try to do that now. So I'm going to open Visual Studio Code and I'm going to go to the extensions tab, and there you can search for an extension called Apache Conf. So there is an extension called Apache Conf, and this is basically the syntax highlighting extension of VS Code for Apache. So if you don't have it installed, just click on install. I've already installed, so I'm seeing the uninstall button. But in your case, if it's not installed in your VS Code, just click on the install button and this extension will be installed in your Visual Studio Code. Let's try to open our configuration in VS Code. Now I'm going to right click on my httpd.conf file and I'm going to open it with VS Code. Now you can see, since I have installed the Apache Conf VS Code extension, I'm able to see better syntax highlighting and I'm able to easily read the configuration of my Apache server. So now inside the conf folder httpd.conf file, I can configure my Apache server. So let's try to quickly go through what configuration is present in this configuration file. The first thing you have to understand is hashtag means a line which is commented. That means this will not be executed. This is just for the readability purpose of the user. Here you can see there is a comment called this is the main Apache HTTP server configuration file and so on. So this is for the user readability, and since it's not starting with a hashtag, it is a line which is executed or interpreted by the Apache server. So here we are just defining a server variable called srb root and giving it a string where Apache folder is present. So this is basically a variable that can be reused in our configurations. And then here the important thing you have to see here is listen port 80. Unless you explicitly tell Apache server to listen on a port, Apache server will not listen on any port. So here after you install the Apache and you go to the page localhost, you are telling to go to a localhost on port 80 since it's HTTP. This was possible because by default the configuration was listening on port 80. So if you want to make your server to listen on port 81 instead of 80, you have to explicitly write a new line called listen 81. Now your server will listen on port 81. Alright. The next thing you can see here is modules. One of the main reasons why Apache server is famous is because of these modules. You can extend the functionality of Apache server or disable the functionalities of Apache server by just enabling and disabling the modules. Using these load module lines, a lot of modules are being enabled by default for the Apache server, and if module tag will run only if the module is present. So by default, if modules are defined in the default configuration for some functionality based upon the modules that are enabled. And there is one more configuration called server admin. This is the email address of the server admin. You can replace it with your email address. And the next important configuration is server name. When you host the web server and its IP address is registered in a DNS, you can make your server to listen to only some specific host names. That means if your IP is suppose x.x.x and if your IP is registered in a domain say abcd.com, if you write server name abcd.com:80, the server will respond if the request hostname is only abcd.com. If you write your hostname in the request as the IP address of the server will check the hostname, and since it's not abcd.com, the request will be rejected. So you can control Apache server to listen to specific host names if required. By default, this line is commented, so Apache will listen to all the host names which will resolve to the web server. That means you can call the server by IP address or localhost or the DNS name if registered, whatever. And this configuration will be applied to only the files that start with .ht, and the error log directive says where the logs will be logged. So the errors will be logged into the logs/error.log file, and the log level is warning. That means only the logs above the warning level will be logged, otherwise they won't be logged. That means the debug level logs, the info level logs, the notice level logs will not be logged. So these are some of the main configurations in httpd.conf file to get you started. So alright, we got to know about the configuration files. Now let's try to do something useful with this server. Let's try to host a folder so that our clients can see the folder over the internet using Apache Server. This can be done using static file hosting. Alright, let's see the configuration where we did the static file hosting by default. Remember the page you see here, it works. It's actually a HTML page. By default, there is a folder called htdocs and you have an index.html file. And if you double click this, you have a thing called it works. Let's try to write hello world here and save this. Alright, you can see hello world here. So basically you're just seeing whatever is in this folder, and this is called static file hosting. So how was this made possible using this configuration file? So first you have to tell about the directory which you are hosting. By default, all the directories for security purpose will not be allowed for hosting. And then after blocking all the directories, you will allow one directory which is the htdocs folder. So you are telling the document root is htdocs. That means the file hosting will be done in this folder. And now you have to configure permissions to this folder, right? So that's why in the directory directive, you are just selecting this folder which is htdocs inside the server root, right? In Apache 24 you have a folder called htdocs in the server root. So you're writing rules for the directory which is server root/htdocs, and here you are writing require all granted. That means people can see this folder, and you're writing allow override none. That means if you have a htaccess file, you can't override this configuration. And then you're telling options, indexes, and follow symlinks. Follow symlinks means if there is any file shortcut present in the folder, it works using the follow symlinks option. If you don't give this option, you can't navigate through file or folder shortcuts. And indexes option means if you don't have a default index.html page in a folder and you visit the folder URL, the contents of the folder will be shown to the user. And in our htdocs folder, there is something called index.html file. Why index.html? You know, already there is a configuration which says directory index as index.html. That means if you go to a folder URL and there is index.html, you will see index.html. Let's try to rename this index.html as abc.html. And now let's try to reload the localhost. Now, since there is no index.html and indexes option is enabled, you can see the whole folder structure in your web browser, and you can just navigate through the files and open the files. So if you want to host your folders through Apache Server, you have to enable this options indexes so that users can see the contents of the folder and go to the file and open and download those files. And if I just remove this directory index.html, if the user goes to the local host, instead of showing index.html, all the contents of the folder will be shown. So if your intent is to do directory hosting, then you can even remove this directory index.html. So this is how you host a directory in Apache. First, provide permissions to the directory by creating the directory directive for the directory. Say require all granted, allow override none, and then enable the options of indexes. If you don't want file shortcuts feature, you can just remove this option also. And hey, that's it. I just hosted my htdocs folder here. Alright, now if you want to host some other folder, you can just change this folder path and it will be hosted. So I have created a folder called docs and there are some data in this. So let me try to change this document root from htdocs to docs, and here also in the directory to docs. So now I am saying the document root is this docs folder, and I am creating the permissions and options for this docs folder. And let's try to save this, and now let's try to restart the server. Already the server is restarted, and let's try to reload localhost. Now you can see the docs folder is visible in our browser. Users can actually see the contents of this browser and download the files. So I can go to dummy1 folder, abc.html, and then You can go to the parent directory, do the navigation here, go to the dummy2 folder. So this way you can do directory browsing or hosting directories through Apache Server. Alright, hosting directory in Apache is really simple. But hey, I want to host two folders on two different ports. How can I do that using one Apache server? And that's why we use a concept called virtual hosts. So there is this concept called virtual hosts where you can run multiple web server instances in your Apache installation. So you can host multiple web servers on different ports or different host names. So for example, let's try to host two folders on two different HTTP ports. Let's try to listen on port 81 and port 82. And let's try to host two folders on two virtual hosts. In our Apache server, there is a docs folder where I have dummy1 folder and dummy2 folder. Let the dummy1 folder be hosted on port 81 and dummy2 folder be hosted on port 82. I can write the configuration in this default httpd.conf file, but the conf file becomes lengthy and not easily readable. So that's why you can write your configuration in another file and link that configuration in your httpd.conf file. So the common practice is you go to the conf folder and there is a folder called extra which says extra configurations, and here you can write your extra configurations and link these configurations in your Apache server. So let's try to create a new file here and let's try to write it test vhosts.conf, and now let's try to link this configuration in our Apache server. So in your Apache server you can just write a line called include conf/extra/test_vhosts.conf. So this was the configuration file path and I have included in my main configuration. So now let's try to write out new configuration in this configuration file and create two virtual hosts as per requirement. So I'm going to open this configuration file with vscode and let's try to create two virtual hosts here. So virtual hosts can be created using the virtual host directive. So I'm going to write virtual host and this is going to listen on port 81 and let's try to close the tag. Alright, now this host listens on port 81, but hey, in the beginning I told that you have to explicitly tell Apache server to listen on a port. So let's try to go outside this virtual host and write listen port 81. Now our Apache server will listen on port 81. Alright, we require the folder present in the docs dummy1 to be hosted by the first virtual host, right? So the path is the server root docs dummy1, right? So the document root for this virtual host is document root space, the path should be given, and since we are using server variables, $server root /docs/dummy1. And since we want to see the folder contents, I'm going to enable the indexes options. So I'm going to write options indexes, and then if you want to log your errors of this virtual host in a separate file, you can do that very easily. You can just write error log and give the path of the custom log file you want to create. So I'm going to say logs vhost1.log. So I'm telling the error logs of this virtual host should separately go to the file called vhost1.log in the logs folder of this Apache server. That means in the main Apache server folder, inside the logs, you should have a new log file called vhost1.log. In fact, we can just write vhost1-error.log because it's for only error logs. Alright, it's almost done. But hey, remember in the main httpd.conf, by default, any directory will not be given any permissions for the users to view. But hey, we are going to actually host our folder, right? That means users should view our folder. They should have the permissions to view our folder. So that should be explicitly done. So let's try to give the permissions to our folder. So I'm going to use the directory directive. So I'm going to say directory, and which directory you're talking about? You're talking about this directory, the dummy1 directory, and let's try to close the tag here. Alright, now I'm going to say require all granted. That means I'm telling that for this directory, allow the users to actually view the files. Alright, I've made my server to listen on a particular port. I've given permissions to the directory which I want to host, and then I've created a virtual host to listen on this port and serve this directory, and I'm telling the options for viewing the file folder structure, and then I'm logging my errors in a different file. So hey, now I can actually host this dummy1 folder on port 81. So let's try to save this configuration, and you can see already we have linked the configuration here in this last line, include conf extra test vhost.conf. Now we are good to go, and now we can actually restart the server and our changes will be visible. But hey, when you create your own configuration, there might be something like syntax errors. So for checking simple errors, Apache has given a very nice utility. Let's try to see what it is. So go to the Apache folder, go to the bin folder and open a command line here in this bin folder and just write httpd.exe space -t. So it will test the configuration for syntax errors and it will say if the syntax is okay or not. In my case, my syntax is right in all the configurations, so I got syntax okay. Let's try to do some error deliberately. Let's try to just do some syntax error. I just did a mistake by not closing this directory tag and saved the configuration file. Now let's try to run httpd.exe -t. You can see the directive is missing the closing tag. So I got my syntax error from Apache. So let's try to close the tag and correct our mistake and save the file. And now let's try to do httpd.exe -t and you got our syntax is okay. So this way, using the httpd.exe -t command, you can easily know where you did some common syntax errors in your Apache configuration. Alright, our syntax is right. Let's try to restart our Apache server and let's try to go to localhost port 81. And hey, our dummy1 folder is visible at port 81. So our virtual host is working. And if I click on this abc.html, you can see the contents of abc.html. So we have successfully hosted the dummy1 folder using a virtual host in Apache. Alright, now let's try to host dummy2 folder on port 82. So again, let's try to copy paste this whole configuration here, listen on port 82 and write the permissions for dummy2 folder and say users can see the folder and create a virtual host on port 82 and the document root would be obviously the dummy2 folder. So write the address here dummy2 and let me try to create the error logs in this another file called vhost2error.log. And now just like that, I'm hosting another folder in another virtual host. So let's try to save the configuration and let's try to see the syntax errors. I'm going to go to the Apache 2.4 bin and I'm going to open a command prompt here and I'm going to check for syntax errors by using httpd.exe -t and the syntax is okay. Now let's try to restart my server. And since my virtual host is listening on port 82, let's try to go to localhost port 82 and now you can see def.html which is in the dummy2 folder. And if I go to def.html, this is the content of the def.html. So in this way, using virtual hosts, you can actually create multiple web servers inside your Apache installation. Alright, in this example, I'm making two virtual hosts to listen on two different ports. There is one more possibility. You can make two different virtual hosts to listen on two different host names. That means if the PC's IP address is x.x.x.x and if the domain name resolution of this server is abc.com, you can make one virtual host to listen to requests for hostname of abc.com and another virtual host to listen the request on the IP address. So let's try to do that example now. Let's try to make this first virtual host listen on port 81 and second virtual host also to listen on port 81. So let's try to delete this listening on port 82 now. Now both our virtual hosts are listening on port 81, which will obviously give error. So here in this virtual host configuration, I'm going to write server name as dummyhost.example.com. Suppose this host name resolves to this IP address, then this virtual host will be activated. And let's try to write here a server name as dummyhost2.example.com. That means if the users go to this host name and this resolves to this IP address, then this virtual host will be activated. But hey, obviously I don't have these domain names registered and I'm not going to make the request on the public internet. So just for the demo purpose, I'm going to trick my Windows machine to resolve this domain name to localhost. So that can be done using the host file present in the C, Windows, System32, drivers, etc. And there's a file called hosts. So in that file, I'm going to open it with Notepad using administrative privileges. And I'm going to create two entries there saying that this host name will resolve to localhost and this host name will resolve to localhost. That means instead of asking the DNS server, this Windows machine will resolve this host name to localhost and this host name also to localhost. So for the sake of this demo purpose, I have made my Windows machine to resolve these domain names to localhost only. Now I got two virtual hosts set up which are running on port 81 but listening for different host names. Alright, let's try to test our configuration and restart our server. So I'm going to the Apache 24 bin folder and open a command line here and write httpd.ext minus t. The syntax is okay. And now let's try to restart our server. And now instead of going to localhost port 81 or 82, I'm going to go to this URL dummyhost2.example.com. Let's try to copy paste this here, colon 81. Now you can see def.html. And now let's go to dummyhost.example.com colon 81. And now you can see abc.html. Even though both the domain names are resolving to the same IP address, based upon the host name, the respective virtual host is being activated. So this way, using different host names in the request, you can resolve your request to multiple virtual hosts. But in most of the cases, people create virtual hosts listening on different ports instead of the same port. So that's it guys. This is how to set up an Apache server and create directory browsing and virtual hosts in an Apache server in Windows. You can see I've created a blog post on setting up an Apache server in Windows. I have given the notes and I've also given example configurations with screenshots so that you can practice it in your own computer. I've also given you the examples for hosting virtual hosts and directory browsing. I've also given you the references to some interesting links and official documentation so that you can do further reading. So please check out the link of this blog post in the description of this video. In our upcoming videos, we're going to talk about how to set up SSL in Apache server to run your sites over HTTPS, and how to configure HTTPS redirection, and how to configure reverse proxy in Apache server. So stay tuned for further videos. Please ask questions or post your valuable feedback in the comment section. Hope you like this video guys. Thank you for watching. Peace.